Well, I want to welcome you all to the launch of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, new multi-year research project. The Bridge Initiative, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia. We see this initiative as a natural outgrowth of the history and the mission of the center. I mean, one of the questions is, well, why this project? Well, I think why a project on Islamophobia, I'm not going to get into that. I had started it, but as my wife said to me, she said, if you do that, you'll be talking the whole length of time, which I have no problem with. You get to a certain age where you really like listening to yourself rather than anybody else. Okay, but I think the reason for the why is the center was created in 1993. The concern in 1993, it was created by Christian and Muslim Arab businessmen from the Gulf. Their concern in 1993, post the Gulf War, post the fall of the Soviet Union, was that Islam would be seen as the next global threat. Very prescient on their part. And they wanted to address that issue. And so the initial title was Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, History and International Affairs, because that's our focus. Whereas we were initially dealing with Muslim-Christian relations, but seeing it as Muslim world in the West, it became very obvious shortly on that it had to be, as it were, Islam in the West, but also Islam in the West, because of events that were taking place and responses that were occurring. And so what we have in our center are faculty who for some time have engaged in research, published books and articles, participated in conferences nationally and internationally dealing with these very issues. The center also, in cooperation with the OIC, convened two major conferences a number of years ago on Islamophobia, international conferences, and published a book with Oxford University Press called Islamophobia and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century. And so you can see in our title, Protecting Pluralism, how it fit in with a penchant that I have of really thinking that pluralism is the issue. It's really not Islam or any other group in our history. It's always the question of pluralism, the principles and values that America stands for. Nathan Brown, who's the director of research, has himself published a widely acclaimed book called The Islamophobia Industry. I get 10% on that, so I do encourage you. As I often say in my books, it's a great gift for Eid, Christmas, or Hanukkah. In recent decades, prejudice towards and discrimination against Muslims on the basis of their religion or religious identity has increased. And this is always an issue. There's an ebb and flow, but a lot of times people say we're turning the corner. And every time they say it, it's very naive. It's a little bit like saying we're now safe in terms of extremism. If we can just get rid of Al-Qaeda, that's it, you know? Or when Khomeini died initially, it's all over. Or domestically, all you need is one incident, as we saw with the Paris bombings, and it lights things up yet again. As a result, we've been dealing with discrimination, prejudice, but equally important, violence, hate crimes, and the erosion of Muslim civil liberties. That's what goes at the heart, it seems to me, of American principles and values, especially the issue of the erosion of civil liberties. The problem challenges and threatens the very fabric of our society, the principles and values of pluralism, religious freedom, and human rights. And here's one of the great ironies. When you go, just relax for a while, I think I'm sailing now. I will try to cut it short. If my wife were here, she'd be going in the back. When you actually look at the reality of the way in which Islamophobes deal, not only their rhetoric, but their actions, it gets very interesting. About a month or two ago, I did 3 cities in which it was put together by a Muslim organization. It was called Stand with the Prophet, Standing with the Prophet. But it was, the one in Dallas occurred right after the Paris bombings. Okay. The net result is you have some local groups, and Texas has a problem with local groups, particularly some Tea Party types. They go into local media. Pam Geller picks it up, the woman behind a good deal of the protests for Park 51. She tweets and calls on her followers to come. That gets O'Reilly to do a show and to also promise that he'll send somebody there. The net result is you have conservatively 500 people showing up, and a gathering that brought out police, SWAT teams, personal bodyguards, helicopter, and FBI. And I've never had an event that was done quite that well. Although it's really quite nice for the ego. You know, you walk into, you know, you're protected by private security. You arrive, you jump out, you go in, please say, wait a second while we clear the area. Then you move to the next room. After a while, you really think, boy, are we significant? Then you're sitting next to the person. Only 2 of us were targeted by Pam Geller out of the 5 speakers. So the 2 of us are sitting together. And before the event, somebody said, go up and help this guy with his vest. And I thought, he's a good friend of mine, that he had injured his arm. And my wife always says, bring a vest, it'll be cold. Well, I put my arm around him and I feel this stiff thing. And I realize he's got a vest to protect him from bullets. The first thing I said to the organizers was, why not me? I mean, I'm next to him. And if not, why not sit me behind him? But, you know, that's that part of America that exists, and that's that part of Europe. You know, especially in the US, for example, they don't look at the number of situations where you have violence and hate crimes in the UK, and the fire bombings of mosques, et cetera, which, relatively speaking, relative to the population, is significantly greater. What will the Bridge Initiative do? We'll investigate and examine attitudes and behaviors toward Muslims in America and Europe. Many people do that, but if you go to our website, our new website, which we've launched, you'll also see that we now have put out a super survey done by our 2 researchers, whom I'll identify later on, and it looks at 2 decades of American views on Islam and Muslims. And it looks at something like 179 or 192, what is it? 179, I got the number right, polls done during that period of time. And ask a whole set of questions and then what conclusions can be drawn. We also will be looking at influential Islamophobic authors, activists, narratives, and funding. Again, other people do that. We will have our own angle. But an important part of what we're going to do is to be looking at media and social media. We operate from the position that says that social media is now the chief influence and arbiter of popular culture. And therefore, when things go viral on social media, as happened when Pam Geller sent out her message, then mainstream media, like Fox, wind up picking it up. And so then you have to look at the networks that exist, and there are networks, their connections, their funding, appreciate that, and then decide, okay, how do we develop alternative narratives that balance? In other words, you can't just approach the issue by simply you know, saying, look at these bad people and the bad things they're doing. The question is, how are you going to address that issue? That's not enough. But it's then developing and communicating these alternative narratives and doing that through social media. And then finally, creating a state-of-the-art website, and we've just launched that as well. The idea of this website is a little bit like Oxford Islamic Studies Online, which was begun about 10 years ago. I'm the editor-in-chief of it. And the purpose of Oxford, at the time when they did it, I said, why do you want to do this? And the whole idea was that when students, scholars, media people, et cetera, want information, you go to the internet. But how do you know you've got a reliable source when you're reading an article, et cetera? We want to set up a trusted portal where we'll not only have our information out there, but where we will place information from all over the world that is relevant to what we're talking about, both the issue, alternative narratives, how to approach things. So that will be the heart of what we will be doing. I will acknowledge at the end the people that have been involved, and therefore what I want to do now is turn to the actual program itself. We're very lucky to have 3 people who I didn't think we would get all 3. And get them all to agree to come on the same day. Now what I have to do, of course, is to find, I know each one of them, but I had worked out. And so now we'll keep it brief. All right. We have Professor Anne Norton from the University of Pennsylvania, who is a prominent scholar, published widely, and has written a book on the Muslim question, which has gotten superb reviews. All you have to do is Google the title and the author. Of course, if it's really relevant, you will find you also have the naysayers. But it is a great book. And as I told Anne at lunch, the amazing thing about it is the foreword to the book is worth reading in and of itself. The person who wrote it wrote an extraordinarily powerful foreword. We have Mehdi Hasan, who's just recently come from the UK, who's held positions with the Statesman, with Huffington Post, very senior positions, is very well known for his work in doing major debates. And one of the things that he's now done is he's come to the US. He'll be working with Al-Jazeera. And what's the title of your program? Hard?
Head-to-head.
Head-to-head. He will be doing that program. And I suggest, if you want to get an appreciation of Mehdi, he is somebody you can Google and see the kinds of blogs that he writes. Extraordinarily effective. We have a good friend of mine, I was going to say long time, I hate the word old, because people occasionally slip into referring that. I like mature much better. A good friend of mine of many years, and he's really not that old, he has two very young daughters. Roland Schatz, who runs Media Tenor. I suggest you go to his website. You'll see from what he's going to talk about today why he's here. This is someone who runs a firm that monitors major European and American media every day, and therefore does studies that look quantitatively as you look at coverage in the world, how much coverage deals with, let's say, Islam and Muslims, and what's the character of it? How much coverage is of extremists or Islamophobic folks, and then how much coverage actually deals with the broader context, if you will. If you will, mainstream Islam, mainstream Muslim life. So we will begin with Anne.
These mics aren't made for women's dresses, so I have to remember to flop it over. I want to thank Professor Esposito, Nathan Lean, and the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding for inviting me to the launch of the Bridge Initiative. I'm honored to be present at the opening of this great endeavor. And I'm particularly pleased with the image of the bridge. I mean, the bridge is a very powerful image. A philosopher once noted that, of course, the bridge brings things together. It unites the once divided and the once separated, but it also enables things to be free. It frees the river to flow, to go forward without obstacles. And my hope for the initiative is that it too goes forward without obstacles. It won't be easy. Every epoch, every generation is faced with its own distinctive trials, tribulations, questions, temptations, distinctive challenges and issues. For the 18th century American founding, it was the sin of slavery, a sin whose legacy still weighs very heavily on the United States. The Jewish question and the shame of anti-Semitism haunted the 19th and 20th centuries. It was then it was the Jewish suicide bomber, the Jewish terrorist, the anarchist that nations feared. It was Jews who were objects of fear and hate and casual bigotry. Vestiges of that bigotry endure, but the Jewish question has largely faded. It was answered happily with an affirmation of equality. But in our time, it's the Muslim question which has taken its place. The figure of the Muslim has become the axis where questions of political philosophy and political theology, politics and ethics meet. It's Islam that's marked as the preeminent danger. This cuts across ideological lines and philosophical schools. Islam is seen as a threat to politics, to democracy, by people on the right and in the less educated parts of the blogosphere, like Pamela Geller, or Debbie Schlussel, or Michelle Bachmann, or Stephen Emerson, or one could go on, unfortunately, quite indefinitely. But it's also true of over-refined European intellectuals, Slavoj Žižek, or the late Jacques Derrida, who argued that Islam was the other of democracy. Islam is seen as a threat to Christians, Jews, and secular humanists, as if this religion alone should not be tolerated. It's reminiscent for anyone who does political theory of John Locke, and Locke's argument for toleration. Should tolerate everybody, except for Catholics and atheists. There's always somebody. And Islam is seen as presenting a threat to women, to sex and sexuality, to freedom of speech, to the state and the state system. But I think these fears actually say much more about Western civilization, such as it is, than they do about Islam. We doubt, quite reasonably, that we've achieved equality between men and women. We don't know how we should govern sexuality. Indeed, we have a Supreme Court thinking about this, even as we speak. We don't know how we should conduct ourselves modestly or appropriately in public. And we're anxious about the rights we hold most dear. We praise freedom of speech, but we often find things we would like to censor. Racist speech, pornographic speech, speech that we believe poses a threat to national security. We at the West worry openly about Muslims and the Muslim world, Muslim civilization, but it's often anxieties about the West that drive our concern, that are most fundamentally at issue. And we have good reason to be anxious. In relation to Muslims, the West has failed to live up to the standards of Western civilization or the standards of the Enlightenment. War, torture, detention, secret prisons, surveillance. The wars we have chosen to fight were not always chosen wisely or honestly, but certainly not well. And they're part of a foreign policy that puts us at odds with Muslim countries unnecessarily and, I believe, unjustly. But it's the manner in which we have fought them that I think is most the greatest indictment of the West. We will not easily, here in America, overcome the shame of Abu Ghraib. We've also said that we fought those wars to liberate women, and we've left them worse off than they were before. It's free speech issues, however, that I think may be the most interesting. In the Danish cartoon controversy, for example, it was not a question of what could be said or drawn. There are plenty of pictures of Muhammad in Denmark if you want one. It wasn't a question of what could be published. They had no difficulty publishing the cartoons. It was a question of what had to be said. The demand that the cartoons be republished over and over again, that everyone had to publish them. This is a form of dictating what people have to say. And it's echoed that in the demand that every Muslim, on every possible occasion, however irrelevant, condemn terrorism or recognize Israel or whatever the issue before us should be. Or the Je suis Charlie campaign, in which we all had to be Charlie, no matter how bigoted the cartoons, how offensive, how much counter to our own sense of what free speech should be. In the Je suis Charlie case, it's one thing to condemn murder, but it's quite another to oblige people to praise bigotry. And there are echoes here, I think, of the 16th and 17th century demands for loyalty oaths. We forget that free speech as an idea, as a right, originated in those struggles, and it was directed not only to free people, to prevent people from being constrained in what they would say, but also to free them from having to say what other people wanted to require them to say. You have to be free to say what you believe, not what someone else wants you to say. Ironically, in the case of the cartoons and the other Charlie Hebdo and the other debates, we fail to recognize when we've succeeded. The remarkable thing about the Danish cartoon controversy was nothing happened in the West. No one was killed, no one was injured. Actually, that's not true. There was one casualty. There was a young Muslim man who died in police custody in Germany. That was the only casualty. In other words, with that one very large exception, the West did what it should do. People could speak freely, they would be heard, and they would be protested by people who thought they were wrong. But our most important failing in the West is that Muslims, individual Muslims, still bear the brunt of systematic and casual discrimination throughout the West. The most compelling Muslim question of our time is this, and this is the test of our civility, of our politics, our ethics, and our scholarship. It is a test we often fail. And yet, there is what I think of as the triumph of the ordinary. You know, we of the West, we live in the presence of Islam. Islam lives here freely and fully, and non-Muslims live with it and learn from it. The coexistence of Muslim, Christians, and Jews is, moreover, strongest where it's most important, where we work. In hospitals, doctors, nurses, researchers work together, indifferent to differences of faith. Well, a friend of mine, a fellow scholar, Paul Gilroy, told me that he first recognized what it meant to live together when he was ill in the hospital, because he looked around and no one cared about anyone's faith, or anyone's nationality or anyone's race. They were all united in a common and fundamental human endeavor to make someone well. But we see this too in the universities, in what we, in who we teach. In my classes, when I teach Muslim political thought, I have Muslims, non-Muslims, I have veiled women, unveiled women, all kinds of people. And this is increasingly common, and I think most interesting is who learns what. You might know this film by Yusuf Shaheen called Destiny. It's a nice film. And in part of that film, a young man comes from France to learn Muslim philosophy. And at the end of this film, I said to my students, this is what you're studying. This is what you will now carry. I carry the teachings of my teacher, Fazl Rahman, and he introduced me to other teachings which I carry. Now you will carry those. And one of my students, a Polish student who had just recently come to the United States, kissed my hand because they were proud to carry that learning. But we work together in the most ordinary ways, in water departments, in public utilities, in all that makes the world run, people manage to work together. So the bridge is being built. Every halal lunch truck on the streets of Philadelphia or Portland, Oregon, or Washington, D.C., and there are a lot of them now, every halal meat counter in the grocery testifies to that success. So it's being built. This effort, the willingness to live without fear, to find common ground with one another, is, I think, the foundation of democracy. I look out and I see that one of my teachers, Charles Butterworth, is here. And he gave me a great gift, which was increased access to the teachings of Al-Farabi, who is my favorite. Sorry, I messed up with the microphone. And I rely increasingly on my reading of Al-Farabi because he writes very effectively and very interestingly about democracy as cosmopolitan, about democracy as rootless, about democracy as something that people desire. And what I find most compelling about this is not where he begins, because he begins where Plato began, but he changes it. For Plato, democracy was something to be feared. For Al-Farabi, I'm not so sure. I think for Al-Farabi, democracy is something to be desired. Plato doubted it, but Farabi, I think, sees its beauty, its power, and its worth. He knew its dangers, but he also saw its promise, that it offered possibly the greatest good in politics. He teaches that democracy is what all people desire, people of all hues, all faiths, all nations, that they are drawn to each other when they find it, and that the world that they make together is built on rock. Thank you.